everyone, it's Alice, and today it's time to wrap up the books I read in March. I managed to read 4 books this past month, which is pretty good, and the first one that I finished was Fish Swimming in Dappled Sunlight by Riku Onda. And this is contemporary mystery-ish fiction, I would say, and it's translated from Japanese, which is pretty cool. It's set in Tokyo, and we follow these 2 people who are spending their last night in their apartment together. They're both moving out, and there's a lot of tension between them, and each one is convinced that the other one is a murderer. And so we basically follow them throughout this night and try to find out why. So this one started off really well for me. We're introduced to these characters and you sort of get an idea of what their relationship is and what it's like, and we get to know them as people and we get to know a little bit about where they come from. And then about 50 pages in, there was a twist. And I read that and I was like, wait, what? I'm realizing this is a little bit of a difficult book to talk about because it is quite slim and I don't want to give anything away. But that reveal kind of does something to the dynamic of what you're reading, and I thought that was really, really good. It's also just interesting to have 2 people stuck in an apartment together and they know each other really well, but there's a lot of unspoken stuff as well, and it creates this like great tension, and it's quite atmospheric even though they're stuck in this tiny apartment together. So it all started off wonderfully and then it lost me. This is a weird book from the get-go, and it has like a strange feeling to it, which I usually really like, but I felt like towards the end it got so strange and vague that it was difficult to understand what was happening, and I didn't really get it. So it started off with what was a fantastic beginning, and then it took a little bit of a turn, which is a little disappointing. I do think this has a lot of great elements to it though, and that suffocating feeling of the apartment is just fantastic, and the twist is really good, or the reveal that we get early on. And so I really liked the beginning, and then it just tapered off a little bit, so I was a little bit disappointed by the end. But overall I feel like it was worth the read, and I'd like to read something else by this author because I really like the tone and like the atmosphere of this story. So I gave this a 3 out of 5 stars. I'm glad I read it. Hopefully I'll get to read something more by this author in the future, but yeah, this is a pretty solid like 3 out of 5. Secondly, I read Hellbent by Leigh Bardugo, which is an urban fantasy novel. It's the sequel to Ninth House, which is one of my favorite books. And in these books we basically follow this student who is at Yale, and she is in charge of monitoring the secret societies of the school, all of which can do different kinds of magic. And this basically just follows the events of the first book, and the first book ended with quite the revelation, so we're sort of picking up from there. I did do a reading vlog where I read this book, and I actually included a spoilery section in that vlog where I talk a little bit more in depth about what happens in the book and what I thought about it. So if you've read the book and you want to see those kinds of thoughts, feel free to check that out. But I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was a very, very good sequel. I really loved being back in this world, and one of my favorite things about this series is the overall feel of them. It's dark and gritty, and the magic system really works for me. It's equal parts fascinating, terrifying, and disgusting. And I like that these books, at least to me, they feel quite high stakes because there's a lot that happens in these books and it takes a huge toll on the characters, which makes sense because a lot of it is really dark. And I like the tension of not ever really knowing if anyone is truly safe. I also really liked getting back to our main character, and I really like that at the core of this book are several female friendships. Like, that took me a little bit by surprise, but there's basically all of these women who are friends trying to figure out how to solve this situation that they're in. And I like how it's not just about getting to this goal, but it's also about leaning on each other along the way. Like, I really, really like that. I will say though that one of my favorite parts of Ninth House is the structure of the story, and the way that it's structured I just thought was amazing. I love it when books do that. It sort of tells you about what is gonna happen at the beginning of the book, and then you go back and you find out how they got there. I love that. And I felt like that worked really well in Ninth House, and it added to a lot of the tension of the book. And this has a little bit of that, but not as much, and it doesn't work as well. This story feels more linear, which is fine, but that was like one of my favorite parts of Ninth House, and we don't really get that with this. Overall though, like I said, I really, really enjoyed this, and I just really love the feel of this series and these books. It's just so good, and there's something about it that just really appeals to me. I think I read somewhere that this is planned to be a trilogy, so we'll probably get one more book with these characters and in this world. I wish that there were going to be more, but if we get another one, that would be great. I do wonder where the story is going to go though. I think that could be interesting to find out, but yeah. Very, very good. I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars. It was great. Then I read a quite new release. It was A Dark Inheritance by H.F. Askwith, and this is historical fiction, urban fantasy, and in it we meet this 17-year-old who is convinced that he is going to die in 30 days on the day of his 18th birthday. He has had 3 older brothers who all died on their 18th birthday, and he thinks that he is next, which is understandable. And there's like talk that this family is cursed to prevent any of the sons from inheriting this fortune. And basically what happens is that this boy finds out that his father was involved with this secret society, and he thinks that this might be a way, like looking into that might be a way to save himself, and so that's where the story goes. I also read this one for a vlog, and if you saw that, you will know that I didn't get on with this book very well. I'm not gonna harp on it too much, but this wasn't for me, and I just don't think this is done very well. One of my main gripes with this is that supposedly this is set in the 1920s, but there is very, very little that actually places us in that time. And maybe it's just me, but when I read historical fiction, I want it to feel like historical fiction, and that is a really big part of reading those kinds of books for me. And this, I felt like this didn't place us in any particular time at all, and if that's the way it's written, I think it doesn't need to be set in any particular time because it's not really important. So I didn't really get on with that. I found that a little bit disappointing, and there's just something about the writing that I didn't get on with. I also didn't really feel like the characters were that well-rounded, and I didn't feel a connection to any of them, and I've basically forgotten all of them by now, and it's not that long ago that I finished this book. I do think the plot has some intrigue to it, and I think it's a really good concept, but in the end, there just wasn't enough for me in this to really enjoy it and get invested, and I basically finished it just to finish it. So this was not really my jam, and I gave it a 2 out of 5 stars. Lastly though, I read some poetry. I read Bargain Bin Rom-Com by Leena Norms, and I find it impossible to summarize poetry collections, and whenever I see anyone else try to, or I like read blurbs of poetry collections, I feel like no one really knows how to do it, so I'm just not gonna do it. But you may have heard of this author because she is also on YouTube and she has an excellent channel. I already knew that I liked Leena's poetry because I've read some of her previous work, and there's something about her tone that really resonates with me. Like, I really enjoy the way she writes. There's always like something in some of her poems that just hit me really deep inside, and I just really, really like the way that she writes poetry. I also really like the different themes that she decides to write about, and there's something about the flow and the tone of it, and like there's a little bit of humor in it and like tongue-in-cheek vibe that I just really like. Very much enjoyed this. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars. It reminded me that I need to get back into reading poetry because when it's good, It is just so good to read. That was the last book though. Those were all the books that I finished in March. I'd love to know what you all have been reading lately and what you've thought of the books that you've read. As always, thank you very much for hanging out with me today, and I will see you soon. Bye!